So, tonight's gospel passage is one of those classic stories of the clash between Jesus and those wily Pharisees, officials of the temple, who are always trying to catch Jesus in some act of wrongdoing to undermine him. We love these stories. They're weirdly Westernish. You could call it white hat Jesus and the black hat Pharisees, who are always foiled in the end. And we see these kind of stories time and time again where the Pharisees just show up in the middle of Jesus' ministry and try to ask gotcha questions and look for technicalities. While Jesus, unflappable with the moral acuity that can only come from being the Son of God, he works it every time. Here's the thing I want you to notice about stories like this, though. We always kind of take it for granted when reading that, of course, Jesus is right. You have to. Our religion is built around this person, so we can't really contradict him. Now, for my part, and for obvious reasons, I don't often tell people this, but my seminary internship was a church and a bar, and I had a bit of a reputation for saying that I thought Jesus was acting kind of like a dick. So, in this story, I don't think he is acting that way. But I also feel like it's very important for us to ask ourselves why Jesus is right when he is, instead of taking it as a given. Because it's easy to say that Jesus is right because he's the Messiah and the Christ and he has the answers for our lives. But we're called to follow in his footsteps, and personally, not being the Messiah or Christ on my end, I need to know how to follow in those footsteps without it being a given that I'm morally right all the time. Which means it's important to break these stories apart for the rest of us who are not the Messiah. So we should first ask ourselves why. Now, the first impulse is a pretty simple empathetic response. I mean, this poor woman has been ill and suffering for 18 years. So of course she has to be healed, even if it's the Sabbath. Now, we as a culture don't really do Sabbath a lot. It's not really one of our things. It's not a priority. But I want to emphasize how important it is in the world of the story that we're looking at right now. We'll get later to the heart of why it's important for us. But let me just say now that it is entirely too simple to just say, well, this woman needs help and healing, and that takes priority over Sabbath. Many of you know that when I'm not behind the pulpit, my full-time job is in street outreach with the homeless. So let me tell you that because this person needs help on its own, cannot be trusted on all the time. Trust me. I have had a client ask me to walk 3/4 of a mile to where she was so I could watch her belongings while she used the bathroom. I have had clients call me at 2 a.m. I did not answer. I once had a client ask me to buy him a gun. You can probably guess how that went for him. My point being that it's really completely folly to let your entire life rest on this idea of when a person needs help, it's my job to help them. Empathy and care are beautiful, wonderful things, but there are limits to our energy and goodwill, and we cannot solve all of the problems in the world. It's a lofty goal. We should look to it for inspiration, but practically it is not a good idea. Our energy, our bodies, our lives are all finite resources. Pouring them out without end will destroy us from the inside out, leaving those who sought our help often worse than before for their experience with us. And I speak from experience here. I have had times in my life where my zeal led me to take on more than I really could handle. I've been bitter and angry and tired from trying to do the right thing all the time, wondering where everyone else was and not giving myself a break. I've lashed out because I wasn't taking time for myself. Now, we're a culture that is far, far more focused on purpose and work and vocation than on joy and rest. So it's easy for us to keep pushing towards that purpose. But if you choose to always help every single person you meet, you will become exhausted and bitter. Trust me. So back to the question, why is Jesus right here? We also say we can't rest on this idea of ours that Sabbath laws are antiquated and we don't need them anymore. Far from it. I think Sabbath is far more necessary for us than it was in this culture, precisely because we have ignored it for so long. We define ourselves by our work, our volunteering, our extracurriculars. Being without work or activity can become a genuine identity crisis for those living in our culture. And that's a problem. In reality, we have a lot to learn from Sabbath practices if we can ever get over ourselves enough to do so. And just to review, I want to say again, it's far, far, far too easy to say that Jesus is right because he's Jesus. Even if it's true, we must look closer. So another thing we have to consider here is what it even means to talk about Sabbath in the first place, which is important because we have a culture have gotten particularly mixed up between Sabbath and one of everyone's favorite buzzwords, self-care. More than that, we don't actually even know what self-care means, but still try to conflate what we think it means with what Sabbath is. So we should take a little time to untangle that mystery. Now, to begin with, it should be said right at the outset that self-care is used as a tool of late-stage capitalism to place the burden of not being overworked on the worker. That is to say, bosses worry about your output, so they will tell you that if you take a few bubble baths, you'll be less stressed about the fact that they're giving you too much work to do. That is one problem. Self-care is not bubble baths or mimosas or pedicures or naps. And I know, I really wish it were naps too, but it's not. The point of self-care cannot be to rest up in order to perform your vocation better, because that in the end is still caring for your job, not for yourself. To borrow a few words from the musician Lizzo, who recently wrote a wonderful piece about this, I don't think that loving yourself is a choice. I think that it's a decision that has to be made for survival. It was in my case. Loving myself was the result of answering two things. Do you want to live? Because this is who you're going to be for the rest of your life. Or are you just going to have a life of emptiness, self-hatred, and self-loathing? And I chose to live, so I had to accept myself. Now, when we talk about what self-care is, to begin with, we're talking about our own survival. More than that, our own living. So it can't be done just for the purpose of vocation, career, or reputation. It must be a genuine act of knowing what is threatening our physical, emotional, and mental well-being, and taking steps to protect ourselves. And that does sometimes mean that you should take a spa day, but it cannot be that alone. Self-care is the very act of taking off all the labels we have to wear for our jobs and our social lives and our community involvement. It's taking away all of the things that we are expected to be and learning to love and protect what is left of us when you strip all of those labels away. Now, self-care, again, is tremendously important, but as I've said, it is not the same as Sabbath. And too many in our church, not our church, but our church, will take off work, get their hair done, and say that that's a Sabbath day. Sabbath also cannot become an obligation. Now, I come from the South, so let me tell you now, it's not a 4-hour church service followed by a 3-hour potluck. It's also not the obligation that the Pharisees are seeing it as here. Yes, there is an obligation to put things aside, but you cannot take these things away and leave the void as a spiritual practice. The obligations must be stripped away for the purpose of something greater. But being experts in the letter of the law, the Pharisees of this story endlessly decide and debate what is and is not right to do on the Sabbath, so that it becomes a chore rather than the life-giving practice that it is. If we look to the text from Isaiah today, there's a nice little gem in there. If you refrain from trampling the Sabbath, from pursuing your own interests on my holy day, If you honor it, not going your own ways, serving your own interests, or pursuing your own affairs, then you shall take delight in your God. The irony here is that both self-care and the Pharisaical vocational obligation makes the mistake of treating the Sabbath as a day to pursue one's own interests. On one end, self-care believes that regularly spoiling yourself is the path to true enlightenment. And on the other, the Pharisaical devotion to the law is really, in the end, a matter of reputation. We know that they're not calling Jesus out benevolently. They're trying to find a weak spot in his armor. Likewise, we can see that the endless debates about what is and is not permissible on the Sabbath are in the end self-motivated. They mean to prop themselves up, make themselves seem more divine than those around them. In the end, they too are serving themselves, but with extra steps. Sabbath is not about ourselves only. That's why it's of a higher level than self-care. Sabbath is a time to reconnect with the divine, not through a day-long church service, because we're still acting when we're in community as a church, and not through bubble baths, because those are still centered on us. Sabbath requires only that we take some time to see ourselves in relation to God, in relation to God's world, and in relation to the cosmos. It's a time to strip away all the labels we bear, the roles we play, the hats we wear, and to remember the kinship between our deepest selves and our God, and the role that we play in the story God is writing. It's especially crucial because in order to understand and feel that unconditional love of God, you have to remove all of the things that you would do normally to meet conditions. You have to let go of the actions you do to try to be right and leave what is there under all of that. Stripping away all of these labels, retreating from our daily lives, giving ourselves a day off work, are all things that we must do in order to see ourselves in the world properly. But you also have to remember that it's not the giving up of them that's important, but taking advantage of that absence to gain perspective on what's really happening when we make our way through life. The problem with our culture self-care is that it forgets that we do exist in relation. The problem with the Pharisee Sabbath is that it forgets to consider that relationship with God beyond what God wants us to do. It doesn't consider why God wants us to do this. It doesn't see the gain, only the sacrifice. And the Pharisees convince themselves that the sacrifice makes them martyrs, but they neglect to gain the perspective of their place in the world. And I should tell you, I am also the worst person in the world to be saying all of this to you tonight, because I hate not being busy. I work 2 jobs. I preach here. I attend another church. I have musical rehearsals at least once a week. I spend time with people, and I'm lucky if I get one evening to myself in a week. If I spend a full day at home, I feel like I'm a bad person. And I actually wrote this manuscript out while I was on the phone with someone who was asking me for advice and counseling. Also, I didn't finish writing this until 3 p.m. today. But maybe that's why it's important, because there must be other people like me who need to hear why this matters, so we'll keep at it. We're also addressing the opposite here, because while I'm saying that Sabbath is important, that's not the main point. We're still considering why Jesus is justified in this story of working on the Sabbath. So let's take a look at this perspective. Jesus is wearing a label here of a healer. And it's a bit of a secret to those who haven't had biblical studies that miraculous healings in this time and place were actually incredibly common. He was not the only person in the world doing this, not by a long shot. So Jesus is wearing exactly one of the public labels that I've just said we have to strip away in order to properly see ourselves in perspective. On the other hand, the woman that we've been speaking about, this poor woman struggling under the weight of illness, conspicuous in her community, pitied and looked down on, she also has a label. She suffers under the weight of her illness and also under the weight of having that label and being seen in the community as someone who is defined by her greatest struggle in life. And trust me, because I see and know people every day who wear the worst parts of their lives on a cardboard sign for the world to see. It is a terrible way to live. It's a modern day stock for those who haven't even committed a crime, really. Many have pointed out that the healing was not the only miraculous part of Jesus' work with those who were sick and infirm, but it was that he saw them and treated them as people before they were healed. He undid the societal stigma while they were still infirm and showed them that he understood their humanity even in the pitied state they were living in. So when he does this work here, he's also taking away the label from a woman who has no power over hers. He may be violating his own Sabbath, but he is also inviting a woman in who has been without that opportunity for 18 years. In this way, he upholds the Sabbath more while violating it than any Pharisees who have made it their life's purpose, which is classic Jesus. So as you go out today, I want you to think about the labels that you bear and really think about them, because honestly, sometimes we love them. I love my labels a lot of the time. And I want you to think too about the identities that you have to lose in order to properly see yourselves. I also want you to remember that not everyone in the world has that choice. There are many who have had these identities glued to them by others and are unable to take them off. Remember them, and do everything you can to provide them with a Sabbath space where the labels don't exist and where they can be fully seen and fully loved as a child of God and an important part of the world that we live in. You should observe Sabbath in order to keep yourself on the right track when you can, but never forget that you too, even without being a fancy schmancy white hat messiah who wins every religious debate, you too can be a healing Sabbath space for those in the world who rarely receive that opportunity. Thank you.